Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 4, so let's get into it. Quentin didn't look at the page from the Netherlands that night. That night, he put a paperweight on it, locked the desk drawer, and propped a chair against it to make sure it stayed closed. He had to teach in the morning. He went back to bed and put a pillow over his head. It wasn't till late the next afternoon, after PA, that he unpropped the chair and unlocked the drawer. Slowly, he eased it open. The page had gone still. But evidently, it had been psyching itself up for this moment, because as soon as he took away the paperweight, it took off again. Quentin watched it thrash along in the air, feeling a little sorry for it. He wondered where it was trying to get to. Back to the Netherlands, probably. Back home. He plucked it gently out of the air and took it over to the window seat so he could look at it in the sunlight. Holding it flat with his palm, he weighed it down at its four corners with a candlestick. An alarm clock, an empty wine glass, and a fossilized ammonite that he kept on his desk. The page knew when it was beaten. It gave up and went still. Now, he could see what he was dealing with. The text was handwritten, both sides closely and minutely lettered, in black ink with an occasional important word in red. It was a serious sort of page, dense with information. The paper was old but modern paper, which gradually ate itself because of the acid in its own wood pulp. But rag paper, made from cotton scraps, which would last practically forever. It was torn along one edge where it had been roughly ripped from its host book. A few letters had been left behind in the process, but only a few. The regular, urgent forward tilt of the black script gave the words a purposeful look, like they were trails of gunpowder leading toward some explosive revelation. Whoever wrote it had had something to say. In places, the text blocks were broken up to make room for charts and diagrams. A table of numbers with a lot of decimal points. A small but precise botanical sketch of a flowerless plant, with neat rows of leaves and a hollow seed pod. An elegant diagram of concentric and overlapping circles and ellipses that could equally easily have been an atom or a solar system. The page began in the middle of one sentence. It ended in the middle of another. When he looked closer, he saw that the leaves of the plant were wavering very slightly in the breeze, and the planets, or electrons, in the diagrams were very slowly progressing in their orbits, which themselves processed in an orderly dance around one another. The values in the table changed in sync with them. At first, Quentin thought he couldn't read the script at all, and he sighed out loud with relief when he began to recognize a word here and there. It was a late, rather corrupt form of Old High German, written in some eccentric variation of black-letter Gothic. He could hum the tune even if he didn't quite get every single lyric. That, however, was the last break he caught. The contents were highly theoretical and abstract, seriously high-altitude stuff, up there where the conceptual oxygen was dangerously thin. There was a lot of business about magic and matter and high-level exchanges between the two under extreme conditions, at the quantum level. Sometimes it was hard to tell how much of it was literal and how much of it was metaphor. When it talked about a rooster, was that some kind of symbolic alchemical rooster? Or was it an actual rooster with feathers, cock-a-doodle-doo? There wasn't much context to go on. In that plant, He was going to have to take this over to Professor Bax in the greenhouse, or, as the students referred to it, inevitably, Botany Bay. After staring at the page for 3 hours, during which he didn't even make it to the other side, Quentin sat back and pressed the heels of his hands against his aching eyes. He'd missed dinner, but he could still eat with the kitchen staff. One thing was clear. This was a fragment chipped off of the great arcane magical database of the adepts of the Netherlands themselves. Penny's gang. It was like an ultra-dense meteorite from some extrasolar intellectual realm, and it had come crashing to Earth, and there was no telling what exotic, unearthly elements it might contain. He'd found a topic for this independent research project anyway. Dean Fogg could stop nudging him about that. And in a small way, he'd found a new adventure. It was a different kind of adventure from what they had in Fillory. A small and kind of nerdy adventure, but there was no question that's what this was. "Thank you," he said to the page. "Thank you for being here. Whatever it is you've got inside you, I'll take good care of it. I promise." Was it his imagination? Did the page unfold itself slightly? Did it preen itself a little, basking in the praise of its reader? He took the heavy candlestick off one corner, then, carefully, the wine glass and the clock. As soon as he moved the ammonite, the page shot sideways, making for the crack under the window. "Not yet." He slapped his hand down on it and replaced the candlestick with a clunk. "I'm sorry. I really am. But not yet." There was one aspect of Quentin's life at Brakebills that was still less than ideal, and that was his social life. He didn't have one. Even though he was almost 30, he was a lot younger than most of the faculty, and he was having a hard time connecting with them. Maybe it was the age thing, or that he hadn't properly paid his dues yet, which was true. Maybe they figured he wouldn't be here that long, so what was the point? The politics of the senior common room were Byzantine, and involved a lot of power struggles to which he, as low man on the totem pole, just wasn't very relevant. Also, it was possible that they just didn't like him very much. It had been known to happen. Whatever the reason, he drew a lot of undesirable solo duties, like refereeing cold, wet welters matches and patching the dull but finicky network of spells that was supposed to bust students breaking curfew. Now that he got a close look at it, he couldn't believe how much they used to worry about getting caught. The spells were so rickety and put out so many false alarms that the faculty mostly ignored them. The next day after PA, Quentin walked over to Botany Bay. His expectations weren't high. He'd never spoken to the department chair, Hamish Bax, and he didn't know what to make of him. On the plus side, he was youngish, at least by Brakebills standards, mid-30s maybe. On the minus side, he was unbelievably affected. He was black and from Cleveland, but dressed in Scottish tweeds and smoked a fat Turk's head pipe. He was the first person Quentin had ever seen in his real life wearing +4s. The whole business made him hard to read, though maybe that was the point. At least Quentin had an excuse to visit the greenhouse, which was a lovely bit of Victorian iron and glass tracery that looked too delicate to withstand an upstate winter. Inside it was a green bubble of warm, humid air, full of tables of potted plants of an imaginable shapes and sizes. The cement floor was wet. Short and solidly built, Professor Bax greeted him with the same lack of interest as the rest of the faculty. He didn't seem particularly pleased to be interrupted during whatever he was doing with his arms, up to the elbows in a giant ceramic pot full of black earth. But he brightened up when Quentin zipped open a velvet-lined portfolio, and the page immediately shook itself and wriggled free, like a silvery fish escaping a net. That's a live one, he said, teeth clenched around his pipe. He wiped his hands on a rag. Using a quick spell that completely eluded Quentin's comprehension, he trapped the page flat in the air in front of him, as if between two panes of glass. It was the kind of fluent, rather technical magic you didn't expect from a botanist. You're a long way from home. Then he addressed Quentin. Where'd you get this? I could tell you, but you wouldn't believe me. Do you recognize the plant? I don't. Think it's a real plant? Drawn from life? I have no idea, Quentin admitted. Do you? Professor Bax studied the page for 5 minutes, first from so close his face almost touched the paper, then from a yard away. Then he had to shift a table crammed with seedlings in egg cartons from across the room. He took his pipe out of his mouth. I'm going to say a word you don't know. Okay, Quentin said. Phyllotaxis. I don't know it. It's the way leaves are arranged around a central stalk, Professor Bax said. It looks chaotic, but it's not. It follows a mathematical sequence. Usually Fibonacci, sometimes Lucas. But the leaves on this plant don't follow either of those, which suggests that its origin is exceptionally exotic. Oh, that it's just a made-up drawing. Right. And Occam's razor says it probably is. And yet, Hamish frowned. It's got something. Plants have a certain integrity to them, you know? Hard to fake that. You're sure you can't tell me where it's from? I shouldn't. Don't then. He gestured at the text. Can you read that shit? I'm working on it. Professor Bax released the page from its trap. He plucked it out of the air before it could fall. It was limp and pliant in his hands. It seemed more submissive to his authority than to Quentin's. Grand, he said. Drink? Yes, was the only possible answer. Bax retrieved a fifth of rye from in among the flower pots, where he'd apparently hastily concealed it right before Quentin came in. Just like that, Quentin had shattered whatever invisible barrier stood between him and the rest of the faculty, or at least one member of the faculty. It emerged over the course of the afternoon that Hamish wasn't much more popular with the other professors than Quentin was. Whatever nameless sin Quentin had committed, Hamish had committed it too. They were the same kind of radioactive. Quentin started coming by the greenhouse regularly after practical applications, and he and Hamish would have a couple of whiskeys before dinner. Hamish initiated him into some of the deeper mysteries of the Brakebills campus. What was really surprising was how much of the stuff that undergraduates whispered about after hours was actually true. That blank stretch of wall, for example, where they ought to have been a room, and the plaster was a shade lighter. That really wasn't an air shaft. Back in the 1950s, some students had set up a cubic thermal field in their room, possibly to keep beer cold. But, having already consumed some of the beer, they invented a couple of glyphs, which had the unexpected effect of diverting the temperature inside down very close to absolute zero. The resulting field was so stable that nobody could figure out a way to dispel it. It was perfectly harmless unless you walked into it, in which case you'd be dead before you knew it. One of the kids who cast it lost a hand that way, or so it was said. Eventually, the faculty just shrugged their shoulders and walled it off. Supposedly, the lost frozen hand was still in there. Likewise, it was true. The clock was powered by a gear made of metal reclaimed from the body of the silver golem of Bialystok. It was also true that there was a childishly humorous anagram for Brakebills, that it was biker balls, and that the chalkboards would squeak painfully if you tried to write it on them. It was true that ivy wouldn't grow on that one bare patch of wall behind the kitchens because one of the stones had been violently cursed in a really ugly incident involving a student who'd slipped through the admissions protocols meant to screen out sociopaths and other people mentally unfit to handle magic. On humid days, it sweated acid. There was also a secret seventh fountain, underground, accessible through a door set in the dusty plank floor of a gardening shed. It was kept cordoned off because the water teemed with hungry, sharp-toothed fish, and Quentin had never known how the maze was redrawn over the summer, but apparently every year in June the groundskeeper goaded the topiary animals into such a feeding frenzy that they fell upon and devoured each other in a kind of ghastly slow-motion vegetarian holocaust. The maze was built up again out of the cuttings from the survivors. Only the strongest made it through. They must have been some of the most highly evolved topiary animals on Earth. This was Quentin's world now, and it was amazing to him how quickly he came to accept it, even embrace it. He'd gone from king to schoolteacher, been forcibly transplanted from the grand magical cosmos of Fillory to this hole in the wall that he thought he'd escaped forever. And lo and behold, he was adjusting. It turns out you can go home again, if you have to. His future was here. The years he'd spent in Fillory were gone now as they'd never happened. He mourned them alone, the only person on earth who knew that once upon a time he used to wear a crown and sit on a throne. But you couldn't mourn forever. Or you could, but as it turned out, there were better things to do. Pacing the aisles of a silent classroom, surveying the exposed napes of rows and rows of students bent over their fall exams, he realized he'd lost his old double vision, the one that was always looking for something more, something else, the world behind the world. It was his oldest possession, and he'd let it slip away without even noticing it was gone. He was becoming someone else, someone new. It was crazy to think that the others were still over there, riding out on hunts, receiving people in their receiving rooms, meeting every afternoon in the tallest tower of Castle Whitespire, and Julia was on the far side of the world doing God knew what. But that had nothing to do with him now. After all that, it turned out that wasn't his story. It had all been a temporary aberration, and in due time it had corrected itself. Though he did still look up at the moon once in a while, expecting to find the clean, crisp crescent of Fillory. By comparison, Earth's moon looked as pale and shabby and worn as an old dime. They were only 100 miles north of Manhattan, but the winters at Brakebills had a different quality from winter in the city. Deeper, heavier, firmer, more decisive. It was as if, because it came 3 months late, Brakebills winter was determined to sock you in for good and all. It was February on the outside, and the birds and plants were beginning to show glimmers of cautious optimism. But Brakebills was still wallowing in 1.5 feet of deep, silent November snow. Now that he was teaching Quentin, Quentin could see why the faculty didn't bother trying to improve the climate. It kept people amazingly focused. You saw the undergrads try to jog their way through the snow, kicking up puffs of powder, then give up and just slog. You could actually watch as the determination to seize the moment and live life to the fullest ebbed right out of them, and they resigned themselves to lonely, silent indoor study instead. There was a perennial proposal on the table, never quite adopted, to keep it winter at Brakebills all year round. Quentin was doing quite a bit of studying himself. He transcribed the whole page, 402 words arranged in 20 sentences. Plus, an incomplete one at the beginning and another at the end, and papered his walls with it. Each word got its own separate sheet, which he filled up with annotations and connected to other words with long, curvy chalk lines to indicate related concepts. He was literally living inside the page. He kept up with his teaching, but other than that decrypting the page was his full-time occupation. As he got deeper into it, he began to run into a lot of mathematics, which he had to work out with a pencil and paper. You couldn't do magical equations with computers. They just spat out inconsistent answers before hanging completely. Magical math had to be thought through with a brain. But the page was beginning to open up. Like tightly furled buds, the words began to bloom and reveal the ideas locked inside them. The concepts unfolded for him, displaying hidden dimensions and interacting with one another in unexpected ways. As they took shape, they also gave up clues as to the much larger, more shadowy whole of which they were just a tiny fragment. The book that the page came from. It appeared to be a treatise on the interactions between magic and matter. On Earth, magic and matter were distinct things. You could cast a spell on an object, and it became enchanted, but the object and the spell remained separate entities. The object was like a piece of metal on which you'd put a magnetic charge, but in Fillory, Quentin knew, or at least strongly suspected, magic and thing were somehow one and the same. Magic existed on Earth, sure, but Fillory was magic. It was a fundamental difference. This was all very theoretical, and Quentin wasn't that into theory. He was still a physical kid at heart, and he was more into practice. Under the right conditions, with enough energy, could you make something on Earth magic? Infuse it with magic? Melt them together till the seams were gone, like they were in Fillory? It felt like a forbidden idea, a boundary you weren't supposed to cross, but it was too delicious not to at least try. He requisitioned an empty basement lab, but even with his newly enhanced magical abilities, it was difficult to force the delicate abstractions of the page into the crude actual world. Either he came up with nothing, or one of the spells would release a huge wad of energy that lit up the room with icy blue light and practically blew out the wards he'd set up to keep himself from being vaporized. As a precaution, he worked the enchantments inside increasingly large, heavy, gluey globs of force, like bubbles blown from a thick, viscous, translucent liquid, which made it hard to tell what exactly was going on. And what would he do with it anyway, even if it did work? What good was something magic? This was a powerful enchantment, but it needed a purpose. It was an answer in search of a question. He was getting older, and it was time he thought about making something, building something that would last. But what? He couldn't see how this was getting him any closer. One evening, standing alone in the senior common room, drinking his first glass of wine for the night and sketching diagrams in his head, he reached into his jacket pocket for his Florian watch, which still didn't work. But he liked having it with him anyway, and found an envelope there along with it. Inside was a letter typed on a manual typewriter, inviting him politely, even decorously, to show up at such and such a bookstore on such and such a night in March if he was interested in a job. The signature was illegible, bird scratchings. Huh, it was intriguing, and Quentin felt a little of the old restlessness. Here it was, another mystery to be solved, your classic passport to adventure, just like back in the old days. But that was the thing about the old days. They were old. This was his life now. He was content and not happy, then happier. Then he even thought he'd be again. He had work to do. He crumpled up the letter and winged it into the fire. It caught, and a heavy fog shifted, sending up sparks. The past was what it was. His home was here, and anything else was a fantasy. That's it for this week. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 5.